Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. And now, with the History of the Papacy diptychs, we have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Alex, Augustus, and Judy. At the Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the History of the Popes of Rome and Christian Church. And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics, and paralytics. And he healed them. Great multitudes followed him from Galilee and from Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. Then those who kept them fled, and they went away into the city and told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 23 through 25. All right, welcome back, everybody. Steve here with another episode from our anniversary series. That's a lot of quotes to start an episode, but they work, and they will be important for us to keep in our mind for the topic of today's tale. And this short few episodes tale, the Decapolis, which is a tale of 10 cities. Let's start out with the really broad strokes of what was going on in the early 1st century AD in the context of these 2 quotes. Then we'll step back in time and see how these cities of the Decapolis fit into the greater story of Second Temple Judaism, the Jewish diaspora, Hellenism, and the development of the earliest Christianity, which is the main topic of this 10th anniversary special of ours. Now, the really short answer is the Decapolis, as the name suggests, is Greek for 10 cities, 10 deca, polis, city. And this was 10 cities, more or less, on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, on the opposite side of the Jordan River from the areas of Judea, Galilee, Jerusalem, and Samaria. And north of Nabatea and the Arab regions of Arabia and the southern Dead Sea area. Sure, there were a ton of cities. I mean, this is the birthplace of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, in this whole area. But these 10 cities more or less, and a few others were specifically Hellenistic Greek cities in a predominantly Semitic, Judean, Arab cultural milieu. Some key questions for this episode are, for me at least, and I think I would love to hear what questions you would add to this, but these were the questions that came to my mind. Why is the mention of the Decapolis so important in understanding the Gospels and early Christianity and Christian movement? How did these cities become predominantly Hellenistic and Greek in an area of the world that was so heavily Semitic? And then we're going to really try to trace the development of this really important geographic and cultural area to try and answer some of these questions and other big questions of how did early Christianity develop into something of a Second Temple Jewish sect into a more broad cultural phenomenon that's attracted attention from every culture of the world, more or less. Let's start off with geography. The cities of the Decapolis are primarily to the east or on the right bank of the Jordan River. Only one of the cities, Scythopolis, lay to the west. All of the cities of the Decapolis are north of the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is one of the key geographic and historical political markers of the whole area. In Hebrew, the Jordan River is called Nahar Ha-Yarden, and the Arabic is Nahra Yordan. The Greek word for the Jordan River is Ulan or Aulan. Forgive me for mispronunciations of all of those above languages. The long and short of it is all of those names mean something more or less like watering place, area between hills or banks. Especially, it means essentially river in one way or the other. And we're just going to call the Jordan River anyways, which would have derived from the Hebrew specifically. The Jordan River effectively splits what we might call the southern Levant or Palestine in half. It is difficult to give these areas strict names because the polities have changed so much. To the east of the Jordan River, we might call that Palestine, historical Judah, the historical Judean and Israelite kingdoms. You have the Mediterranean Sea, and then the Pentapolis, the biblical ancient Near East Pentapolis of the Philistines, which was right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, pretty much in the Palestinian territories of Gaza. Now, to the west, this is the semi-arid to very arid areas leading up to Mesopotamia. Getting out, you're starting to move out of the Fertile Crescent, basically the area inside that desert area inside of the Fertile Crescent. But very important trade routes went through this area. To the north, you have Syria, Lebanon, and then the Galilee region. To the south, you have the Sinai Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Red Sea, and then more important trade routes that would go to Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and then henceforth beyond. The Jordan River rises in the highlands of Lebanon, particularly Mount Hermon, which is over 9,000 feet or almost 3,000 meters high. So definitely no small hill. And this is a region of high mountains. The Jordan River is formed by a natural depression from a huge rift that runs from East Africa all the way up into Anatolia. This rift valley determines much of the geography of the whole region. As the Jordan River runs south, which that's how it runs, is south, it first hits or creates the Sea of Galilee or Lake Tiberias. It's known by both of them. historically and presently. It's not a huge lake. It's only about 21 kilometers north to south and 11 kilometers east to west, and has a surface area of 166 square kilometers with a maximum depth of 157 meters. Now, meters, this, that, I didn't translate it into square miles or hectares or acres or whatever. I'll give you some examples because I don't know. I don't think that way in meters or even necessarily in square miles or whatever, but I'll give you some comparisons just to keep in your back of your mind. The little tiny lake, if you look in a map between Lake Huron and Lake Erie right next to Detroit called Lake Sinclair, can fit nearly 10 seas of Galilee or Lake Tiberias is. So if you just look at a map, I mean, that Lake Sinclair looks tiny compared to Lake Erie and Lake Huron or any of the other Great Lakes, a little tiny thing. And it's 10 times the size of the Sea of Galilee. Or as a little shout out to my upstate New York homeland, Lake Oneida, which is the largest lake completely inside of the borders of New York State, is about the same size as the Sea of Galilee. And if you look at a map of New York State, it hardly even shows up. It's basically a little blue dot in the middle of the state. The Finger Lakes look much bigger on a map, but if you smush them up, they're in area not as large as this lake, but they are much deeper. So enough with our upstate New York geography. This lake or Sea of Galilee, Lake of Tiberias, whatever you want to call it, gets all of its water from the Jordan River and just a few small tributaries, and it gets very little rainfall, so the lake is salty, not fresh. After the Lake of Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River continues to run due south, where it's fed by two small tributaries as it continues its journey. After about 100 kilometers, 60-ish or so miles south, the Jordan empties into the Dead Sea, one of the lowest places in the entire planet. So very little water flow and rain makes it into the Dead Sea, which makes it incredibly salty. And that's why the water levels are dropping so drastically, because Jordan River water is diverted for various agricultural means and necessities, and it gets less rainfall than it often does. And for various reasons, it gets less snow runoff from the mountains, and that's why the Jordan River is getting smaller. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. With all of that, we've set the geographical borders of the Decapolis, particularly using the Jordan River. Now let's get into how a sea of Hellenism came about in the middle of an area traditionally not defined by Hellenism or Greekness. Now, we could go way back in time and discuss the demographics and the anthropology of the Levant and the western end of the Fertile Crescent. There's many fascinating groups of people who spoke one version or another of Northwestern Semitic languages. Most of these groups had related cultures as well. Different groups and cultures: the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Philistines, the Neo-Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Neo-Hittites, and other groups rolled through and in and out of this area. Arab-related groups such as the Nabateans lived in this area for centuries as well. The antique kingdoms of Judah and Israel were to the west of the Jordan River complex, but there was some spillover into the neighboring countries. In the 500s BC, the Persian Empire from the east rolled over the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Persian king Cyrus the Great gave the areas he conquered a fair bit of latitude on how they ran themselves. If a locality ran smoothly, the Persians were quite light-handed in their rule. You pay your taxes, you don't be a pain in the neck, and you can keep your language, religion, culture, and much of your governmental administration. We'll see that became somewhat of an overall trend that would ebb and flow in this particular area. The Persians ran this show in this area for a few centuries until the rise of the Greek Macedonians under Alexander the Great. And that really gets in that way the Persians ran their empire. You pay the taxes, and what the Greeks would say is bend the knee to them, basically say that the Persian Empire had suzerainty over you. You got it along pretty well. The Greeks had a really big problem with giving up that symbolic power to the Persians, which would cause the great deal of conflict, which would lead to the rise of Alexander the Great. Essentially, it created this idea of Greekness and that we're Greeks and we're standing against the Persians. It gave Alexander and his dad, who got that all started, Philip II of Macedon, the idea of this idea that we need to unite the tribes of Greece and go take the fight to the Persians. To skip through all of that, Alexander began his campaigns in 335 BCE. Alexander, without getting into all the detail, Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire from Egypt to Sogdiana, which is modern-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, on the borders of China, to the Punjab region of Pakistan/India. All of this took less than 10 years. For us today, Alexander gained control of the area of Palestine and the southern Levant after two key battles, the siege of Tyre and the siege of Gaza. Egypt threw in its lot pretty quickly with Alexander without a fight, and they were more than happy to be done with the Persians, which that settles the southern end, the extreme southern end of the Levant, once Egypt was settled down by Alexander's forces. By 332 BCE, the entire southeastern quarter of the Mediterranean Sea region was completely under Alexander's control. Alexander didn't last long, though. He died in 323 BC at the unbelievably young age of 32. Alexander's empire quickly fell apart as his leading generals, they were called the Diadochi, grabbed as much land as they could. Two important generals rose to the top, especially for the area we're concerned about now. And that was Ptolemy I Soter, the savior. He took over Egypt and into the southern part of the southern Levant, or what we might call Palestine. Seleucus I Nicator, the victorious, took over a huge swath of land, which was pretty much the entire eastern part of Alexander's empire, and then reaching into Asia Minor, also the northern part of Palestine and Levant. The successors of Ptolemy and Seleucus fought over the area of Palestine for years. Eventually, Seleucus controlled most, and the Seleucids controlled most of Palestine. Greek soldiers settled into these areas after their retirement. Then Greek administrators, traders, and all that came with conquest moved in as well. They moved into existing cities and built their own cities as well. Now this entire area was open to the process of Hellenization. Now, I know everybody out there knows what Hellenization is, but a quick review is always worth our time. It's the process of areas adopting Greek culture, religion, language, learning, and values, and social mores. A lot of ethnic Greeks moved into the areas Alexander conquered. Alexander preferred the more hands-off, localized approach of the Persians, but also mixed with the ideas and ideals of the Greek city-state. Existing cities and newly established cities adopted the style of Greek cities with their own town councils, gymnasium, and many other cultural and civic institutions that these Greeks brought. As these things go, some local leaders were all in on adopting the culture and institutions of their new leaders, and in other cases, some people resisted. We'll talk about a major resistance in just a minute. Let's just take a very brief discussion of ethnicity versus culture. Many of the people who settled in areas Alexander conquered were, in fact, ethnically Greek. But as we see, many locals adopted Greek cultural elements. The locals also blended Greek cultural elements with their own culture to make a hybrid culture, a new identity. An example, I think, of this in a more modern sense could be the Japanese before and after World War II. They adopted many Western and particularly American cultural aspects. English words entered their language, but also many aspects of Japanese culture came into American usage as well. This adoption and adaption can be asymmetrical in many ways, especially in the conqueror-conquered, colonizer-colonized dichotomy. Sometimes the conquered culture is completely subsumed over time. Sometimes the conquerors, quote unquote, go native and largely adopt the conquered's culture. Sometimes there is a blending of cultures. Each actor adopts and adapts to the other's culture in an attempt to find some sort of harmony in between the two. Sometimes cultures clash between conqueror and conquered. Sometimes the clash is inside of the conquered culture's ranks. And everything in between. You can see how all of those things would play out. And I'm sure all of you out there could think of different examples of each of these, and I'd love to hear of them. If you don't want to send an email and discuss this more. But for our discussion today, the Greeks did adopt aspects of the cultures they conquered, but they also laid down a very thick layer of their own culture as well. So much so that the lingua franca of the entire region from Anatolia to Egypt to the Levant, even into Persia for a time, the lingua franca turned from the Semitic Aramaic language to the common Koine Greek. Greek civic institutions were adopted, the boule town council system, the gymnasion, temple structures, the building of monumental architecture to increase the prestige of the city. Even though Alexander formed an empire, the idea of the city-state mentality reigned. Hellenism was such a powerful force that even to this day, there are many vestiges of Greek culture in the Middle East. We could get into some of the more surprising vestiges, but that's maybe too much of a deep dive for today. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Now, believe it or not, the harmony between Judean and Greek didn't really happen. There was some, but it didn't last forever in the macro scale. The Judean and the Second Temple Jewish relationship with the Greeks is maybe one of the most rocky of the entire former Alexander the Great Empire. And I think the Judean Second Temple Jewish interaction with the Greek Empire, this new Hellenism, is really, in my opinion, the most fascinating interaction of probably the entire empire. So let's get into some of the details. Jerusalem and the area of Palestine, Judea, was in the borderland between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids everywhere else. Ptolemaic rule was pretty light on the Judeans. They could worship as they chose to. They could keep their culture and or adopt Greek cultural elements, but Hellenism was not imposed. Remember, in one way or the other, and for one reason or another, the Ptolemies translated the Jewish holy books into the Septuagint. So they were down with learning more about the cultures that they conquered. After some wars and conflict, the Seleucids conquered Judea from the Ptolemies in 198 BC. These Seleucids were not as big on peace, love, and understanding like the Ptolemies. Things were about to change big time with the new Greeks in town. The Seleucids' region of control was just so vast that it was hard for them to tamp down all the problems and all the uprisings they were having. They made their base in the area of the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea in the city of Antioch, which is about 650 kilometers north of Jerusalem, or a good solid 2-week travel by land or a week by sea. The Seleucids grew weak over time. A particular king of the Seleucids, Antiochus Epiphanes, wanted to make the Seleucids great again. He began to seriously impose Hellenism around his empire, but particularly on the Second Temple Jews. Some Jews had no problem with that. The high priest of Jerusalem at the time, or one of them, was all about Hellenization. The high priest of the the Second Temple of Jerusalem was named Jason. Just pause on for a second on that. What do you notice that's wrong with that high priest's name, Jason? It's a Greek name. His original name was Yeshua, a good Hebrew name, solid. He was so Hellenized, he changed his name to a Greek name. So Hellenism was imposed with the help of some of the Jews in power. Greek language in particular became very popular. The local Jewish leaders in Jerusalem even wanted to build a gymnasion or a gymnasion. Now, the gymnasion has an interesting history. Originally, it was a place where Greeks went to practice sports and athletics. And it slowly evolved into a place to meet, discuss philosophy, and learn, etc. Sort of like the Roman baths, if you keep that idea in mind. Although in the gymnasion, it was always an athletic and sports function. It always carried those. Now, that word gymnasion comes from a Greek root, gymnos, meaning naked. And the naked part was a major problem. To play in the gymnasium, you see, you had to take off all your clothing all the way down to your drawers. Going about naked was very taboo, and it still is taboo, and the Judeo-Christian value. It's generally taboo in the Middle Eastern cultures as well, all the way back then, all the way to today, not only for women, but for women and men alike. It was particularly against the Mosaic law. We often think of women wearing the hijab or similar full dress coverings from head to toe in Middle Eastern culture, but traditionally, men wore and even wear as much clothing as the women do. Head coverings too, especially in prayer. We come into another big problem. Antiochus decided to put idols into the Second Jerusalem temple. He sacrificed pigs in there and put idols on the Holy of Holies altar. Greek idols were spread all throughout Judea as well, into the synagogues and other sacred spaces of the Judeans and Second Temple Jews. Some Judeans/Jews might have been somewhere on a continuum from cool to lukewarm on all of these changes, and really all the way to just accepting of them. Others were well past cool on the spectrum, though. They were wholeheartedly and passionately against these changes and adaptations. Let's stop here with the divisions inside of the Judean area of the Seleucid Empire. We'll start next episode with a revolt that should have never succeeded, but because it did, the world would change forever. Thank you for joining me on this trip through the history of the early Christian church. And we will get into more of the issues specifically of the Decapolis and how this Decapolis formed in the next episode. And then as we continue, we'll talk about some of the specific cities of the Decapolis as well. So I hope you join me on this, and I will talk to you soon.